Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about histology. What does histology mean? Whenever you see the suffix logy, that means the study of. And hist means tissues. So histology is the study of tissues. We have several different tissues within our body. Today we are going to focus on our epithelial tissue. We have different types of tissues such as epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous. As I said, we are going to focus on epithelial tissue for this video. You can see that the most common function of epithelial tissue is going to be covering. So epithelial tissue usually covers surfaces, whether those surfaces are external surfaces such as your skin or internal surfaces such as lining your intestines or lining your blood vessels. But we are going to actually study how, depending on how the epithelial tissue looks like, and depending on its location, the function is going to vary from one epithelial tissue to another. So if you see right here, this image, you see that the most common tissue we have is actually the epithelial tissue. It's widely spread. You do find epithelial tissue within your skin, and your skin is known to be the largest organ. We do have epithelial tissue lining our hollow organs, and we do have it lining, for example, your intestines, lining your blood vessels, lining the branches within your lungs, lining the cells within your lungs. So as I said, epithelial tissue is very common. Now, for us to take a look at epithelial tissues under the microscope, we take a sample of the tissue and we preserve it so it can last for a long time. We go ahead and we slice it, so we cut it so that we are able to view it under the microscope, and we go ahead and we stain it so that it would be easier for us to view under the microscope. You find epithelial tissue covering and lining external surfaces such as your skin. You also find epithelial tissue lining internal surfaces such as the tubules within your kidneys, such as lining your intestines, your stomach, the bronchial branches within your lungs. As you can see listed, epithelial tissues have several different functions. Now, what determines the epithelial tissue function is actually several things. One is its location, where is it located? Number two, its structure. And there is a main theme that says structure determines function. So the structure of each epithelial tissue, meaning how many layers is it made out of, does it have any extra special features, which we are going to talk about in more detail. So the structure is going to determine its function. For example, let's say that you have an epithelial tissue that's made up of only one layer. So if it's made up of one layer, that means that it's pretty thin. So if it's a thin layer of tissue, its function is not going to be for protection because it's only one layer. Its function is mostly going to allow diffusion to take place, secretion to take place, filtration, etc. Because if it's thin, then molecules are going to have an easier time passing into and out of that tissue. So it's going to make it easier for things like oxygen or carbon dioxide, for example, to diffuse. So therefore, you would have lining your lung cells, you would have a thin layer of epithelial tissue, a thin layer that's going to allow for the oxygen and carbon dioxide to pass into and out of the lungs, basically diffuse through pretty easily. But if you take a look at your skin, our skin is protecting us. And so therefore, for our skin to really give us the protection that we need, our skin is made up of epithelial tissue that's made up of multiple layers. Because the more layers that epithelial tissue is going to consist of in our skin, the more thick it's going to be, and so therefore it's going to give us the protection that we need. And so as you can see, depending on the structure of the epithelial tissue, that's going to determine its function. As we said, like for example, if you have a one-layered epithelial tissue versus multiple layers epithelial tissue. And then there could be some extra features that we are going to talk about that can also determine the function of that epithelial tissue. One of the characteristics of epithelial tissue is polarity. Polarity is that the epithelial tissue has two surfaces. One surface is known as the apical surface, and another surface is known as the basal surface. Basal coming from the term base, so it's going to be mostly the surface that's going to be attached to some other underlying structures or more tissues. Apical is going to be the surface that's basically exposed to the exterior or exposed to a hollow cavity. If you think of your skin, the very top layer of your skin, that very top layer is exposed to air. And so that very top layer of your skin is actually going to be considered the apical surface of the epithelial tissue. Now, the basal surface is going to be attached to the tissues that are going to be below that basal surface. Now, so for example, if you have right here a layer of tissue, okay, and I drew my cells, so those block looking like structures, those are the cells, and you can see that I only drew one layer of cell. Okay, so this is a one layer epithelial tissue. Now this surface right here, I labeled it 1 because this is going to be my apical surface, because this is going to be the one exposed to the free surface. So let's say that this is my skin, so this is a layer of my skin right here, then this is going to be the apical surface exposed to the air. Now where is the basal surface? The basal surface is going to be right here, that black line that I drew, that black line right here is going to be the basal surface. Now notice how where I wrote number 2, there's underlying structures underneath it, and so therefore the basal surface, it's not exposed to air, it's not exposed to a cavity. There's actually going to be some other tissues and some other structures right underneath it attached to it. And so therefore it's not as it's not free like the apical surface. If you think of a blood vessel, okay, you know how a blood vessel is hollow from the inside to allow like the blood to basically rush into that blood vessel and flow through it. So notice how this surface right here that's basically exposed or basically it's facing the hollow cavity of the blood vessel, that would be the apical surface. So the apical surface, as I said, it's either exposed to air, okay, or it's exposed to the hollow cavity. For example, the hollow cavity of your blood vessel, the hollow cavity of your stomach, the hollow cavity of your intestines, right? So the cells that are facing the hollow cavity, those cells we would call the surface where you have those cells, we would call it the apical surface. The basal surface would be attached to some other tissues. So this is actually a histology image of your blood vessel. So again, notice how your blood vessel, it's hollow from the inside, again, to allow the blood to pass through it. Do you see how lining this hollow cavity, which by the way, you refer to a hollow cavity, you can use the word lumen. So lumen means hollow cavity. So notice how what's facing the lumen are those cells right here. I would call this surface the apical surface. Why is that the apical surface? Because it's the one facing the hollow cavity. Where would the basal surface be? Like the basal surface would be right here, okay? And notice how there are other tissues attached to the basal surface. So here would be the apical surface, and then like right here would be the basal surface attached to some other tissues. So all epithelial tissues have two surfaces, an apical surface and a basal surface. Now notice how I drew some like a red structure right here. I'm just using different colors to make it easier. In reality, it's not red and it's not blue. Under the basal surface, there is a layer right here represented by that red layer. This layer is known as the basal lamina, and it's a non-cellular layer. Okay, so it's not made out of cells. It's just made out of a bunch of proteins and a bunch of collagen fibers that are like those proteins, for example, that you would find in the basal lamina. They're actually secreted by the epithelial cells. And that basal lamina is basically going to act as a filter membrane that's going to determine which molecules are going to diffuse into your epithelial layer. Below the basal lamina, there is another layer represented right here by that blue layer right there. That's known as the reticular lamina. And it's also non-cellular, and it's also made up of a bunch of collagen fibers and a bunch of proteins. And together, the basal lamina and the reticular lamina, we call those two layers collectively the basement membrane. And as I said, that basement membrane is going to act as a filter layer, separating your epithelial tissue from the tissue that's going to be down here. And the tissue down here, we're going to talk about it, but you're going to have some connective tissue down here. So that basement membrane, one more time, it's going to act as a filter membrane, and it's going to reinforce the epithelial tissue, helping it resist any stretching and any tearing, and it also defines like the epithelial layer boundary. Okay. If we look at the epithelial tissue right here, here is going to be the apical surface, and as we said, the apical surface is going to be exposed to a hollow cavity or to basically air. The basal surface is going to be down here, and as we said, below the basal surface, you're going to have the basement membrane, which is made out of those two lamina layers that we talked about previously. Now, the apical surface could either be smooth and slick, or it could have some features attached to it, such as microvilli and cilia. Right here, this brush border right here that you see, it's a bunch of microvilli. Having microvilli increases the surface area of your tissue. What does that mean? It means that it's going to allow for more absorption to take place if you have microvilli. So the question is, do all of your epithelial tissues have microvilli on their apical surface? And the answer is no. It's just going to depend on the location of where you have that epithelial tissue. For example, if we think of our small intestine and think of its function, your small intestine is going to digest food and absorb the nutrients. So therefore, it would make sense that your apical surface of your intestinal tissue is going to have microvilli to allow for more absorption of the nutrients. but you're not going to have microvilli, for example, on the apical surface of your skin, because what would you want to absorb? Okay, so it's not going to be there, but it's going to be, for example, lining your intestines. Or instead of having microvilli on the apical surface, you could have cilium. Now again, not all of your apical surface of your epithelial tissues would have cilia. Again, it depends on the location. So what do cilia do? As you can see, first of all, cilia, they're a bit taller compared to the microvilli. They're thinner and taller. And because they're thinner and taller, they can actually sway back and forth, moving and sweeping particles. And so if you think of, again, your intestines, instead of your intestines wanting to sweep away things, your intestines actually want to absorb more nutrition. And so therefore, your intestines would have microvilli. Where would you have cilia, for example? You would have cilia lining your windpipe, which is your trachea, because in case you inhale air that has some dust particles, you don't want those dust particles to reach your lungs, and so therefore the cilia lining your trachea will actually sweep away the dust particles so that they don't reach your lungs. Another characteristic about our epithelial tissues is that epithelial tissues, they are avascular. In medical terminology, the prefix A means without. So avascular, meaning without blood vessels. So your epithelial tissues, they do not have any blood vessels. And that's true for all epithelial tissues. No matter where they are located, all epithelial tissues have 0 blood vessels. And so the thing is, blood vessels contain blood and contain nutrients and gases. And so how could a tissue stay alive? Because your epithelial tissue are alive. So how could your epithelial tissues stay alive without any blood, without any nutrition, without any oxygen reaching them? And so they are actually going to get their nutrition from the underlying connective tissue. So under the basement membrane of the epithelial tissue, you would have connective tissue. And the reason why underneath it you would have connective tissue is because connective tissue has a bunch of blood vessels. So if I draw, let's kind of, here is, let's say, your epithelial, your layer of your epithelial tissue, and here are my cells. As we said, this is going to be the apical surface. Right here is going to be my basal surface. And then, as we said, underneath your basal surface, you're going to have your basement membrane. So right here, that's my basement membrane. Now underneath the basement membrane, what I'm going to have is basically connective tissue. So right here, underneath my basement membrane, this is going to be my connective tissue right here. And the reason why I have connective tissue underneath it, because connective tissue have a bunch of blood vessels. So let's say those are my blood vessels right here. Now, as we said, blood vessels contain blood cells, contain nutrients, gases. So here, let's say those are my nutrients within my blood vessels. Now, are those blood vessels going to reach up to my epithelial tissue? No, they're not. But the nutrition within your blood vessels, or the gases, like oxygen, for example, within your blood vessels, they're actually going to be able to move up. So they're, as you can see, like they are diffusing into your epithelial tissue. And so that's why it's actually pretty important underneath your epithelial tissue to have connective tissue, to be able to get the nutrition those epithelial tissues need, they must have a layer of connective tissue underneath them. So it's not an option. Wherever you have epithelial tissue, there must be connective tissue underlying that epithelial tissue. Another thing is that your epithelial tissues, they are innervated. Innervated meaning that they do have nerve fibers. So as I drew on the previous slide, we said that you are going to have connective tissue underneath your epithelial tissue to provide it with the nutrition that it needs. Other than providing it with the nutrition that it needs, it's also going to help reinforce that epithelial tissue. It's going to prevent the epithelial tissue from stretching and tearing easily, and it's going to reinforce it and kind of reinforce the boundary of that epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue, another characteristic is that it's able to regenerate itself. As we said, the top layer of your skin is made out of epithelial tissue. How many times have you scratched yourself? Or how many times have you torn your skin and it grows back? So the reason why your skin grows back, because that top layer of your skin is made out of epithelial tissue, which is able to regenerate itself pretty fast. How many times did you accidentally bite the inside of your cheek and again you bled? Then after give it a few days and the skin inside of your cheeks just regenerates. That's because again it's made out of epithelial tissue. And there are certain areas where that regeneration process is going to be pretty fast, depending on how much friction is that epithelial tissue getting exposed to. Now, to classify our epithelial tissue and to basically name it, there are multiple parts for the name. So the first part of the name is going to tell you how many layers, how many cell layers is this tissue made out of. If the tissue is made up of only one layer of cells, we call it simple. If it's made out of two or more layers, we call it stratified. Then the second part of the name is going to indicate the shape of the cell. If the cell looks flat, we call it squamous. If it looks like squares or basically little cubes, we call it cuboidal. If it's more like a rectangular shape, we call it columnar. So let's go ahead and check it out together. Okay, so here is my epithelial tissue. Notice how this epithelial tissue, it's only made up of a single layer of cells. So if it's a single layer of cell, what am I going to call it? I'm going to call it simple. Notice how this epithelial tissue right here, it's made up of multiple layers of cells. So if it's made up of multiple layers of cells, we're going to call it stratified. So that's usually the first part of the name, either saying that it's made out of one layer or is it made out of multiple layers, so simple or stratified. There's also pseudostratified, which we are going to discuss shortly. And there's also something known as transitional. I'll also explain it shortly. But after you go ahead and indicate how many layers of cells you have, you go ahead and you explain how do the cells look like. So notice right here how the cells look flat, and the nucleus, by the way, this purple structure right here is the nucleus of the cell. Notice how it's like squished. So when it looks squished like this and flat like that, that's going to be a squamous cell. So I would call this tissue right here simple, because it's made out of one layer, squamous, because the cells are flat, epithelium. So this tissue right here would be known as a simple squamous epithelium, or you can say simple squamous epithelial tissue. Okay, this one right here, it's made up of multiple layers, so I'm going to call it stratified. Now, the thing about stratified tissue is that you can have several different shaped cells, meaning that I can have some squamous cells up at the, apical surface, and I can have down here by the basal surface, remember how this is the basal surface, I can have, let's say, cuboidal cells. Okay, so if I have apical looking like cells that are up at the apical surface looking like squamous cells, and I have some cuboidal cells down here. Which one am I going to choose? Am I going to say stratified squamous epithelium, or am I going to say stratified cuboidal epithelium? Go with how the cells look like near the apical surface. So if near the apical surface they look flat, even though they might start looking differently down here, just go with how they look like at the apical surface. So I would call this one right here stratified squamous epithelium. If they look squamous by the basal surface, but they look cuboidal near the apical surface, I would call it stratified cuboidal epithelium. So as we said, when we are naming our epithelial tissue, first mention how many layers does it contain. So either say simple or stratified, for example, and then the next you would explain how the cells would look like. If they are flat, they are squamous. If they are cube-shaped, then they are cuboidal. And if they are rectangular shaped, then they are columnar. And you can see right here, here are the cells, and the purple looking structures are representing the nuclei. So the nuclei for the squamous, as you can see, they're usually flattened out like so. For the cuboidal cells, the nucleus is usually circular, and then for the columnar, the nucleus looks like it's stretched out, elongated. And as we said, when you are looking at a stratified tissue, and you might see that in a stratified tissue you have, let's say, all three shapes, or you have two shapes, like you have some cells that look cuboidal and columnar, always go with how the cells look like by the apical surface to name the tissue. Let's take a look at a few examples of our epithelial tissues, and so we are going to start off with seeing some histology images of our simple epithelial tissues. So as we know, whenever you see the word simple, you know that we are going to be looking at epithelial tissues that only have one layer of cells. So if it's made up of one layer of cells, that tells you that those tissues are pretty thin. And so therefore, they are not going to be able to provide protection because they are pretty thin. And when you need protection, you definitely need a stratified tissue. So what's the function of simple epithelial tissues? Because they are very thin, they are going to allow for molecules to be able to diffuse easily through them. And so you're going to have them in areas where absorption is taking place, where filtration is taking place, where secretion is taking place. So in regions where, for example, filtration is taking place, you are not going to have a stratified epithelial tissue. You are going to have a simple epithelial tissue. An example is a simple squamous epithelium. So one more time, simple meaning that you have one layer, the cells look flat. So that's why it's called simple squamous. And whenever you see simple, right away, you are going to be thinking of functions like filtration, absorption, secretion, okay? You are not going to think of protection. So right here, this is a histology image. This is an image of your lung cells. So we are going to eventually, when we get to the respiratory system, we're going to talk about those alveoli cells. But this is an image of your alveoli cells. And notice how you have cavities. Those cavities are basically the hollow space. And the reason why it's hollow, because those are going to, this is where you're going to basically inhale the oxygen. So the oxygen is going to go into those hollow spaces. So therefore they are hollow. Whenever you see a hollow space, by the way, you can call it lumen. Okay, so lumen means a cavity. Notice how lining the lumen, lining the hollow cavity, you have cells. And so that would tell you that this is the apical surface. Why is that the apical surface? Because that's the surface basically lining or facing my hollow cavity. Now, if you zoom in on the image, and I did provide you with the PDF, so you are welcome to zoom in as much as you want to check it out, to check out how those cells look like. But if you zoom in, you would notice that it's made up of single layered cells, and the cells look flat. And so therefore, I would call it a simple squamous epithelium. And so you would find simple squamous epithelium, for example, lining your lungs, lining your blood vessels, lining your kidney tubules, because if you think of your kidneys, you're thinking of filtering out your blood. If you're thinking of your lungs, you are thinking of oxygen and carbon dioxide wanting to diffuse easily. If you're thinking of your blood vessels, again, you want the nutrition to be able to diffuse easily out of your blood vessels. And so therefore, in those locations, you would want to have a simple tissue and not a stratified tissue. This is an example of a simple cuboidal. So right here, you notice that you have a single layer of cells. And notice how the nucleus, right here, the nuclei, they look circular. And so that would tell you that it's a simple cuboidal epithelium tissue. This is the lumen. Here is the hollow cavity right there. And so therefore that would be the apical surface. Right here would be your basal surface. And notice how by the basal surface you have that dark purple tissue. That would represent basically the connective tissue. Remember how we said underneath the basal surface you have a layer of connective tissue? And remember how I said you must have connective tissue underneath your epithelial, because that's how the epithelial tissue is going to get its nutrition. So simple cuboidal epithelium, again, its function is going to be to allow secretion and absorption to take place. And so you would find it in areas like your kidneys, one more time, lining your ducts, like, within your glands. Again, it's not going to be for protection because it's only made up of one layer of cells. If we look at this tissue right here, you notice that it's made up of a single layer of cells, and so it would be simple. And then the cells look like they are rectangular and their nuclei look elongated. So I would call this tissue a simple columnar epithelium. Here is the apical surface because, as you can see, it's facing the hollow cavity. Here is the basal surface because underneath it is my connective tissue. Now you can see that this simple columnar epithelium could have, not all of them, okay, but some of them, they do have microvilli on their surface. We already talked about it. Microvilli is going to increase the surface area of the tissue, meaning that it's going to increase the rate of absorption. Another feature you see within that tissue, right here, this is mucus, by the way, And the cell that's producing the mucus is known as a goblet cell. And you can see it right here. So here's the goblet cell. I do want you to know that goblet cells produce mucus. Now again, do all simple columnar epithelium tissues have goblet cells? No. It just depends, again, the location. So if we think of our small intestine, your small intestine would actually have both, because your small intestine, this is where your food is being digested. So you do want to have microvilli to be able to absorb as much nutrients out of the food that you are digesting as possible. Another thing is your small intestine, you would want to have mucus production there because you don't want your intestines to start clumping to one another. You want to have mucus to help lubricate your intestines. And so therefore, to allow for that lubrication, you definitely want to have those goblet cells that would produce the mucus. Sometimes you do have simple columnar epithelial tissues that have cilia on their apical surface, and sometimes you don't. So if you do have cilia, we usually call it ciliated. If you don't, it's a non-ciliated tissue. So right here, for example, one more time, here is a single layer of cells and they look elongated. So I'm going to call it simple columnar. And here is the mucus, okay, being produced by your goblet cell. And you can have a slick surface with no microvilli, no cilia, or you can have a bit of cilia on the top, okay? Or instead of cilia, as we've seen in the other on the other slides, you could have microvilli. Right here, you can see that fuzzy stuff right here. Those fuzzy hair-like structures, those are actually some cilia. Remember how we said you want to have cilia wherever you want to sweep things away. Okay, and by the way, cilia or microvilli, those are always going to be by the apical surface. You will never find cilia or microvilli by the basal surface because the basal surface is going to be connected and it's going to be attached to the connective tissue. Okay, so this is just another image of a simple columnar, but with cilia on its surface. So far, we've talked about simple and stratified. So I would use the term simple if my tissue is only made up of one layer of cells. I would use the term stratified if my tissue is made up of two or more layers of cells. So what is pseudo-stratified? Pseudo means false, fake. So if you say fake stratified, that means that it looks like a stratified tissue, but that's really a fake because it's really a simple tissue. So it's a simple tissue, but it gives you the fake impression that it's made up of multiple layers. So if you look at this tissue right here, notice how you see multiple nuclei, and notice how the nuclei are like on top of each other. So it's giving you the impression that you actually have several layers of cells laying on top of each other. So it's giving you the fake impression that it's a stratified tissue. But it's not. It's actually a simple tissue. And the reason why when you look at it, it kind of confuses you and you think you're looking at a stratified tissue. That's because the nuclei are, they're not all at the same level. The nuclei are found at different levels. So one nucleus is all the way at the bottom, but then the cell right next to it, like here is my cell and here is the nucleus right at the bottom. But then notice how the cell right here, the nucleus is missing from the bottom. It's actually all the way up to the top. So when you have one cell, one nucleus at the bottom, one nucleus at the top, and it kind of keeps alternating like this, it will give you the fake impression that it's stratified. But yet it's not. Now, would you say a pseudostratified function is for protection? No, because it is not made out of multiple layers. So it's really a very thin, single-layered tissue, and so therefore, whenever you see pseudostratified, think of, function-wise, think of secretion and absorption. Don't think of protection. Okay, and again, a pseudostratified tissue could have cilia on its surface. It could have microvilli on its surface. You can have mucus produced by goblet cells. That could all be possible within your pseudostratified columnar epithelium tissue. And you do have it lining your nasal cavity, by the way. So the tissue lining your nasal cavity is a pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And so one more time, here is the apical surface, here is the basal surface, and as we said, you will always have connective tissue underneath any of your epithelial tissues to provide it with the nutrition and support that it needs. Okay, that's a pretty good image to show you the cilia right here. Notice how thin they are to allow to sway back and forth. So you do have cilia lining your windpipe to sway the dust particles so it won't reach your lungs. And again, it kind of totally gives you the impression that it's made up of multiple layers of cells, but it's just because the nuclei, as I said, they are found at different heights. And so this is a pseudo-stratified epithelial tissue. Now, if you do have 2 or more layered cells, then we are going to call it stratified. And usually when stratified tissues regenerate, they regenerate from the bottom and the new cells keep rising until they reach the top. Definitely stratified tissues, they are more durable than simple epithelial tissue. Therefore, whenever you see a stratified tissue, right away think of protection. So that's an easy way to think of the different functions of your epithelial tissues. Stratified, protection. Simple would be for things like filtration, absorption, and secretion. So your skin is, the top layer of your skin is made up of a stratified squamous epithelium. Again, why would I have stratified tissue within my skin? Because think about it, your skin is exposed to a lot of harsh conditions, and so therefore you need protection. If that top layer of your skin was simple, imagine how quickly it would get destroyed. And so right here, this would be the apical surface because it's the one exposed to the free exposed surface right here. This will be the basal surface. Down here would be the connective tissue. Okay, as we said, you always have to have connective tissue underneath your epithelial. Notice how the cells by the apical surface look flat and squished, and so therefore I'm going to call it stratified squamous. Doesn't matter whether they totally look different down here by the basal surface. When I'm naming it, all I care about is how the cells look like by the apical surface. Now, your skin on the top of, like right here by the apical surface, your skin is actually keratinized. That means that your skin cells produce a protein known as keratin. You've probably heard about keratin before, especially, for example, if you ever bought like keratin shampoo. So keratin is a protein found in your hair, found in your skin, found within your nails. And keratin protein just gives more protection and more durability. Now, does that mean all stratified squamous epithelial tissues have keratin on their apical surface? No. Okay. For example, you have stratified squamous epithelial tissue lining the inside of your mouth. Lining the inside of your mouth, it totally makes sense to have a stratified tissue to give you more protection, but it's not keratinized. It does not have keratin on its surface. And again, the keratin just gives you more protection. Since the inside of your cheeks, you usually have your mouth closed, it's not as exposed as like the skin on your arm, for example, which is exposed to definitely much harsher conditions. That shows you right here, like you have 2 layers of cells, so that's definitely a stratified tissue. And look how the cells look like squares, so that will definitely be a stratified cuboidal epithelium, which is again going to be, it's going to provide protection. Stratified squamous is the most common stratified epithelial tissue we have. We don't have a whole lot of stratified cuboidal, so it's not as common. It's found lining some of your sweat glands, some of your mammary glands, and you can see right here underneath it you have your connective tissue right here. So that would be the apical. One more time, that would be the basal. Underneath the basal you have the basement membrane, and then you have the connective tissue down here. This is a stratified columnar. Okay, so you can definitely see the multiple layer of cells. You can see that the cells kind of look elongated. One more time, whenever you guys are thinking of a stratified tissue and you're trying to figure out its function, protection. Okay, just go with protection. And so stratified columnar, you find it in areas like lining the urethra, lining some glands, lining the pharynx. The pharynx is your throat. Okay, so the pharynx is your throat, and so that's why, again, think of your throat and think of hot things you're drinking, cold things, like all of the different textures that you are swallowing. You don't want your pharynx to be lined by simple tissue. It would be destroyed in no time. Another type of epithelium tissue we have is known as transitional. Transitional just means that this type of tissue has the ability to stretch. And so if you think of your urinary bladder has the ability to stretch when it's filled with urine. And then it also has the ability to kind of recoil back to its original shape after you void your urine. And so you find transitional tissue lining your urinary bladder, lining your ureters, which are basically the tubes that will take the urine from your kidneys and take it all the way to your urinary bladder. You would find it also lining your urethra. Transitional tissues are usually stratified, so as you can see, it is a stratified tissue. It's just that we don't call it stratified, we just call it transitional epithelium right away. But it is a stratified epithelium tissue.